Reflections, The Last Days in Modernity, Part 1. Excerpts from Biblical Critical Theory, How the Bible's Unfolding Story Makes Sense of Modern Life and Culture, by Christopher Watkin. If one aspect of the Christian's parallax attitude is to understand the culture and its artifacts, then any Christian cultural critique today will want to come to a rich understanding of late modernity. Where did it come from? What does it believe? And why? One prominent biblical playbook for this task of cultural listening is provided by Paul's famous Areopagus address of Acts 17, quite rightly a famous passage of writers on Christianity and culture. In this video, I would like to provide you with an illustration of how the author imagines what contours an Areopagus-inspired reading of our late modern culture might take. Paul's main approach to cultural critique in Acts 17, much like Augustine's City of God, is to identify the religiosity of the culture and then point out its limits and internal tensions. I see that in every way you are very religious. 17:22, he begins, going on to point out that this religiosity is founded on a fundamental ignorance. 17:23, the Athenians do not know the gods they are worshiping. If we are to read late modern Western culture through this same hermeneutic lens, what might we say? The question is not easy to answer. Analyzing our own cultural moment is like trying to examine spots on our noses without a mirror. We are too close to it to be able to make out anything distinctly, and intense focus is more likely to cause a headache than create insight. We can, however, use a mirror, which in this case amounts to taking a long view, or what Nietzsche and Foucault call a genealogical approach, examining how we got to where we are today. With our historical mirror in place, an Areopagus-inspired genealogy of contemporary society might start something like this. People of modernity, I see that in every way you think yourselves very irreligious, but your irreligion is very Christian. This is the great contradiction at the heart of late modernity. Its secularism is so thoroughly religious, its atheism so deeply theological, yet modernity itself is for the most part either unaware or unwilling to recognize it. Paul saw a profound ignorance at the heart of first century Greek culture. At the heart of our own is a profound blindness. When late modernity attacks Christianity, it does so with Christianity's own values, and when it proclaims freedom from religion, it performs a deeply religious move. We can trace some important lines of descent in modernity's family tree by following three related ideas: the individual, the universal, and the secular itself. They will also reveal the self-deception at modernity's heart. The ideas of the individual and the universal might seem an odd place to begin the task of tracing the main contours of modernity. What about technology? What about freedom? What about democracy or the secular? These are indeed important modern trends, but without exception, they all rely on the twin poles of individuality and universality. These two related ideas are the coordinates in terms of which modernity is plotted, the operating system on which it runs, the skeleton that gives its flesh its shape. Modern anthropology, ethics, politics, even metaphysics move between the poles of the individual and the universal. These two concepts are Modernity 101. Our masterful guide on this genealogical journey is Oxford historian Sir Larry Siedentop, CBE, whose book Inventing the Individual is a brilliant treatment of the emergence of individuality in the West from ancient Greece until the Renaissance. Before we can set out on our safari, Siedentop warns us we need to examine ourselves. Our problem is that we think the individual and the universal are obvious and inevitable categories. Of course, there is a thing called society. Of course, it is a collaboration of individuals. Of course, everyone should obey the same laws. To help us understand that our view of the world is far from obvious, Siedentop begins by inviting us to consider the earliest Greek civilization, an utterly remote moral world to our modern sensibilities. In this ancient world, we find a pattern of life that has no concept of an individual conscience. In Homer, not even a word for intention. Reason is used to reinforce social hierarchy, the ruling classes are thought to be rational, and everyone else rationally deficient, even subhuman in the case of slaves, or as Aristotle will later call them, human tools. Nor do we find here anything we would recognize as universal. The basic unit of society is the family, later grouped into clans, cities, nations, and occasionally empires. The main cultural force that introduced the figures of both the individual and the universal into the West, Siedentop argues, was Christianity, and the great catalyst for the invention of the individual was Paul. In Paul's writing, there emerges for the first time a concept of individuals whose identity is not exhausted by the social roles they happen to occupy. If I am a mother, I am more than a mother. If a son or slave, more than a son or slave. Paul's great discovery is of a human will that is pre-social. The gap opened up by early Christianity between identity and role also introduces the novelty of freedom of conscience, summed up in the credo, I believe, of the Christian creeds. Philosopher Michael Serres comments, when the first Christians said, I believe, they suddenly knew that they were no longer either slaves or senators, foreigners or women, Jews or Greeks, sailors or farmers. They were for the first time singular individuals, alone before God and by the grace of Jesus Christ. With this new freedom of conscience and distance from social roles, there also emerges a new kind of hero, the martyr. This is not the sort of modern-day suicide bomber who kills for what they believe, but the Christian martyr who is killed for what they believe. The martyr universalizes heroism at the same time as they individualize it. Martyrs are the first universal heroes. While the ancient hero, Homer's Odysseus for example, was a strong, successful male aristocrat, the Christian martyr could be anyone, women, children, and slaves included. But the martyr also individualizes heroism, because whereas the ancient Greek hero strengthens the social order by defeating an enemy or restoring family's honor, the martyr stands apart from society, refusing to submit to the hegemonic order and witnessing against its prejudices and tyranny, even at the cost of their life. The seeds of this new figure of individual are watered in later church history. Tertullian defends the claims of individual conscience by arguing in the 3rd century AD that it is a basic human right that everyone should be free to worship according to his own convictions. Augustine's Confessions is the first example of autobiography in Western literature, and the first major exploration of inwardness, the idea of an inner dialogue between the individual and God. Paul and Augustine also democratized rationality by associating it with the conscience, rather than with a privileged class. Finally, it is only a slight exaggeration to say that Augustine, drawing on Paul, invented the idea of the will. The canon law that emerged in the 12th century also enshrines this new figure of the individual. The degree of guilt and punishment now takes account of the intention of the defendant, not merely the effect of their actions. This rise of the individual can be summed up in Paul's proclamation in 1 Corinthians 15:10 that, by the grace of God, I am what I am. My identity is not given by my corporate role within the family or a clan, but directly by God in a way that transcends all my earthly roles. In terms of the universal, the New Testament witness radically redefines that most fundamental building block of ancient society, the family. Breaking the closed genealogy of the family bloodline, Jesus subversively proclaims that whoever does God's will is my brother and sister and mother. Mark 3:35, and see also Mark 10:29 through 30. Paul addresses Christians as brothers and sisters, adelphoi, taking a term reserved for family relations and applying it to the church. The individual also replaces the family as the focus of immortality. What lives on is not the family name, but the individual's soul. C.S. Lewis explains the distinctiveness of this Christian view in contrast to modern materialism. To the materialist, things like nations, classes, civilizations must be more important than individuals, because the individuals live only 70-odd years each, and the group may last for centuries. But to the Christian, individuals are more important, for they live eternally, and races, civilizations, and the like are in comparison the creatures of the day. Lewis's words are not particularly controversial for many today, but in the ancient world they would have been laughable nonsense. For the pre-Christian mind, what survives is not individuals, save a handful of heroes who become gods, but families, clans, and traditions. Individual posterity could be guaranteed only through memorialization in statues or inscriptions, which led to what has been called a fear of oblivion, driving a need to accumulate honor and social capital for fear of having one's name veiled in the thick blackness of obscurity. We see miscreants punished by having their names chiseled off monuments for this very reason, mirroring the practice that has emerged recently, notably after the 2021 Auckland terrorist attack of refusing to name perpetrators in public. The universal was also shaped in early Christianity by what Siedentop calls Paul's great wager on the moral equality of all human beings. We are all equal, whatever social roles we happen to occupy. This assumption is present in the Golden Rule, and classically proclaimed in words that have launched 1,000 philosophical articles in the last decade. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Galatians 3:28. This verse takes aim at the three immovable social hierarchies of the ancient world: gender, race, and slavery. Paul replaces these categories with one group that cuts across them all: those who are in Christ Jesus. It encapsulates what Siedentop calls Christianity's egalitarian moral intuitions that turn Greek abstract thinking into an almost ferocious moral universalism. For the first time, husbands are enjoined to their wives as equals. Slaves and masters call each other brothers and sisters, and the universality of the church was expressed in its care for the poor. Philosopher Elaine Bajou considers Paul's writings to be the foundation of universalism. In Paul, he argues, we see truths to which no one is an exception. Commenting on Romans 3 verses 29 to 30, is he not the God of Gentiles too? Yes, of Gentiles too, since there is only one God, who will justify the circumcised by faith and the uncircumcised through that same faith. Bajou argues that Paul's genuinely revolutionary conviction is that the sign of the one is the for all, or the without exception. It is a novelty that led to a cultural revolution upon which we still depend. Combined with the principle of reciprocity, do to others what you would have them do to you, Matthew 7 verse 12, this egalitarianism provides the West with a new ethics and a new politics, utterly foreign to the ancients' world understanding of natural law as everything in its place. Along with moral equality and the imperative of reciprocity came a new principle of association, a voluntary association of uncoerced and morally equal individuals of universal scope. This gave birth to a new social order based on individual intentions, not on blood ties and publicly enforced status differences, transfiguring the late Roman concept of citizenship into a truly universal community. The immortal soul, rather than the immortal family, was the primary constituent of reality, and we see emerge that very modern player on the public stage, the people. Never before had there been anything quite like it, argues Tom Holland. A citizenship that was owed not to birth, nor to descent, nor to legal prescriptions, but to belief alone. Over time, this new universality became enshrined in law. By the 7th century, the principle of personal legislation, different laws applied to different groups within society, gave way to the territorial legislation. Everyone in a given territory should obey the same laws, reflecting the new sense of justice in Paul's writing, premised on moral equality rather than natural inequality. Reflecting both the emergence of the individual and the universal, the canon law formulated in the 11th to 14th centuries became the original vehicle of modernity. Taken together, the individual and the universal plot the coordinates of modern society and modern politics. Moral equality, the universal, and conscience, the individual, are the foundations of modern societies and modern ethics, and both ideas sink their roots deep into the writings of the Apostle Paul. The twin inventions of the individual with a will and conscience, and a universal sphere based on voluntary association rather than race, class, gender, or consanguinity, rhythm, and pattern, the modern world. For example, and many more examples than we have time for here could be brought. The martyr, who resists society's values and laws out of conscience, provides the model for the late modern world's last remaining great hero narrative. The lone individual who defies them and remains true to herself or himself for the sake of the dream or authentic identity expression. As Oliver O'Donovan notes, just like the Christian martyr, there must come a moment when the modern individual stands apart and looks upon the social system, as it were, from the outside. In the words of the 2021 Marvel Black Widow trailer, at some point, we all have to choose between who the world wants you to be and who you really are. Today's media industry, as well as today's identity politics, owes a debt to the figure of the Christian martyr. The idea of human rights, first formulated by the medieval canon lawyers, is also a legacy of this development, as is the fact that rights are born by individuals, not by a family or a class. Furthermore, the idea of a deep, supremely precious core of an individual's identity that precedes and outlasts any social role has undergone a metamorphosis from the Christian soul to the 19th century construct of sexuality, as Michael Foucault implies. We expect our intelligibility to come from what was for many centuries thought of as madness, our identity from what was perceived as a nameless urge. Hence the importance we ascribe to it, the reverential fear with which we surround it, the care we take to know it. Hence the fact that over the centuries, it has become more important to us than our soul. The Christian idea of the individual beholden to his own conscience exerts a similar influence on modern political and social life. The legal and administrative model of the late medieval church became the pattern for the European nation-state and precipitated what Charles Taylor calls the Great Disembedding, in which society came to be understood as fundamentally made up of individuals rather than families, guilds, and corporations. On a social level, Christian moral equality and reciprocity are the basis for what Charles Taylor calls modernity's order of mutual benefit, the idea that all individuals in society should have equal rights to life and freedom. These ideas were also the foundation of the Enlightenment universalism of thinkers like Immanuel Kant and Voltaire, for even those who pushed their quest for the light of reason to overtly blasphemous extremes, could not help but remain its heirs. Finally, it also paves the way for the universal equivalence of capital. The ethic of moral equality gave birth to new forms of comparison within and across groups in society that had previously been considered hermetically sealed from each other, resulting in a new type of restless and progressive culture. As Siedentop concludes, Christianity did not just win the game, it changed its name and its rules for all who were to follow. Family and clan loyalties were from now on considered subordinate to an inviolable individual identity given by God. Christian moral beliefs emerge as the ultimate source of the social revolution that has made the West what it is.